Good afternoon. Welcome to our event on drug trafficking, organized crime, and electoral process in Latin America. Welcome to you all. It's great to see so many faces. And also we have quite a lot of friends and colleagues online. So hopefully it's going to be a very interesting session. So first thing, just making Pilar Domingo's apology. She had a health emergency this morning, so she had to cancel. But we were just discussing that kindly the three panelists will speak a bit more in their opening remarks. So everybody's going to have 13 minutes rather than 10 minutes. So it's good in a way. My name is Irene Mia. I'm Senior Fellow for Conflict Security and Development in Latin America here at the IISS. I'm also the editor of the Armed Conflict Survey series, which is one of the flagship publications of the IISS, and one publication where Latin American organized crime and criminal violence sadly features quite prominently. I will be chairing the event today, and I'm very pleased to be joined by an excellent panel of experts, which I will introduce shortly. So as you have seen in the invite, today's event is going to focus on a very concerning phenomenon which has become increasingly entrenched and also diffused in Latin America amid the rising cloud of state armed groups or criminal groups, and the progressive weakening of the state in most countries in Latin America, and also weakening of democratic standards, which it's very much interrelated as well. The phenomenon has to do with the rise of organized criminal groups as quasi-political actors. We have seen over the past few decades this armed group have significantly expanded their footprint, influence, and wealth in Latin America, obviously fueled by the large profits generated by their very varied portfolio of illicit activity, drug trafficking in the first place, but also other activities which, those groups are very good at diversifying into different type of criminal business line, I would say, lately environmental crime, but also many others. So I would say that what we've seen in the region, also in our work here at the IISS, is that irrespective of the specific characteristic of those groups in the specific countries and specific national dynamics, what we see is that most of those organizations have shared a common trajectory. The imperative to really try to secure the strategic goals has transformed them into quasi-political actors. This has entailed infiltrating the state, influencing election, as we're going to see today, using votes, but also political violence, and also direct military confrontation in many cases. So there are countless examples of all those different strategies. We have seen, obviously, political violence in Ecuador, most recently, but also Mexico, the election in Mexico, with many instances of political violence. But also upfront confrontation with the states, which we have seen obviously again in Ecuador. As you will remember, in January, Ecuadorian president declaration that the state was engaged in internal armed conflict was actually quite striking. But that's by all means not limited just to Ecuador, Haiti, and also Central America, of course, in the past few years. So this year is an important electoral year in Latin America. We're going to have election in Venezuela, in Mexico, but also important referendums like in Ecuador, also an electoral process, I would say, an interim government process starting in Haiti as well. So we actually thought to focus this event today on this element, and now those dynamics, which are, as we said, very much entrenched unfortunately, in Latin America, are going to influence or play out in those elections. So we try to cover all those points to the extent possible. We have a great panel of experts, which I will introduce very briefly before we start, in order of their opening remarks. So to my right, Vanessa Buschlutler. I had to practice all that. We were discussing actually who has the most complicated last name. Mine is the easiest. I'll try again. Vanessa Buschlutler. Is it good? Perfect. Who is Latin American Caribbean editor at BBC News Online. Vanessa has been covering Latin America and the Caribbean for BBC for many years in different platforms. She's of course a regional expert, but also she has special interest on on the role of played by criminal networks, drug trafficking, and the prison system in the region. Vanessa has a MA in Latin American Studies, North American Studies, and Political Science from Freie University in Berlin. Welcome, Vanessa. We're very happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
And then Dr. Raul Cepeda Hill. He says that his last name is more complicated, but I don't think so. He's a research professor, sorry, that's Monica. It's a departmental lecturer at the Oxford University Department of International Development. Raul is an interdisciplinary sociologist and political scientist with a focus on the nexus between socioeconomic inequalities and conflict, particularly in Latin America and beyond as well. He's currently researching youth recruitment by criminal organization in labor market inequalities in the Latin American drug wars. He holds a PhD in sociology from the School of Security Studies in King's College and master's degree in political science from Colegio de Mexico. Monica Serrano, last but not least, is a research professor of international relations at Colegio de Mexico, but is also a dear friend of the IISS. He's also associate fellow with the Latin American program and the Conflict Security and Development program. We're very happy to have you here in person in London for the first time in an event. Monica's research focuses on the interfaces between security, drug trafficking, organized crime, and human rights. She's especially concerned with the consequent tensions for the regional and global governance architectures. She has published several books, articles and book chapters on international institutions, human rights, and drug policy. And she also has a PhD from Oxford University. As I mentioned, Pilar won't be able to join us. We send her our best wishes and hope to welcome her in another event in the future. So before we start, just a quick note on housekeeping. We welcome questions, of course, from all of you and also our colleagues online. We will try to make the discussion as interactive and inclusive as possible. We start with a round of introductory remarks, and then we were open for discussion with all of you. For people online, it would be good actually if you can type your question on the Q&A box you have on the screen, so that I can kind of pick them up in the course of the conversation, also in the Q&A. I think it's the best way, given that we have hybrid participation. So as I said, first round of remarks, 30 minutes each. And if I may, I will probably ask Vanessa to start. As we mentioned, it's a very important electoral year this year. I think from your kind of privileged regional position and coverage of the region, if you could give us a general overview of what is happening and also highlight how these criminal dynamics are likely to play in election this year.
I'll set the timer.
It's okay, don't worry.
As a radio person, I'm a bit obsessed with time, so I think there's no doubt that the illicit drugs trade has had a profound impact on politics in Latin America and the Caribbean over the past decades, and that it also dominates much of the coverage. So for journalists like me, a lot of our time is spent covering this. And in fact, if you'll permit me a little personal anecdote, when I was pondering whether to apply for the job of Latin America editor at the BBC in 2010, I remember discussing it with my father, and he said to me, "Are you prepared to spend a lot of your time writing about drug lords and their exploits?" And I guess I said yes, because I'm here today. But one of the things that I think is always very important is to not lose sight of the people in these regions and how it affects them. And that's why I'm very pleased to take part in this panel, which deals with the electoral processes and, of course, democracy and how it affects normal people. So one thing that I also would like to note is the worrying extent to which criminal organizations have, in some cases, infiltrated and in others undermined democratic institutions, and how this worrying trend is not confined to the countries which have long grappled with these kind of problems of drug trafficking gangs, such as Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Colombia, but has spread to nations which had been considered relatively safe and whose electoral processes may not have been perfect, but were largely free of the influence of organized crime. And of course, the first and foremost example of that is Ecuador. In 2018, the murder rate was 5.8 per 100,000 inhabitants, and there was a Gallup poll asking people how safe they felt, and the majority of Ecuadorians at the time said that they felt safe to walk alone at night. So big change there. By the end of last year, the murder rate was 8 times that of 2018. And it has now got the highest homicide rate in Latin America. There's always some debate there because some countries aren't very forthcoming in giving their murder rates, but by all accounts, it's got the highest or one of the highest in the region. I don't think that the murder rate in itself tells the whole story. And we are here to talk about the influence of drug trafficking and organized crime on electoral processes. But here again, sadly, Ecuador is an example of how organized crime can and is threatening democratic processes. I think everyone here will remember the shocking assassination of Fernando Villavicencio, who was one of the presidential candidates in the election, who was shot dead last year. And that was less than 2 weeks before the presidential election. Now, the prosecutors investigating this assassination say it was planned from behind bars, from inside prison, by a prison gang called Los Lobos. But even though some people have been charged, many questions, I think, are still unanswered, probably more questions unanswered than answered, especially because 7 of the suspects which had been in pre-trial detention were murdered themselves. And the violence in Ecuador has not abated since Mr. Villavicencio's assassination. And the man who was elected president in the wake of this shocking assassination, Daniel Noboa, has had to grapple with the situation. He declared a state of emergency in January after another shocking incident. This time it was the storming of a TV station by armed men while a program was going out live on air. So the pictures were beamed across the nation and internationally of these gunmen holding the staff and presenter hostage. And in the wake of this particular incident, Daniel Noboa declared that state of emergency. Now, according to him, to Mr. Noboa, there are 40,000 people belonging to drug gangs in the country, and that's roughly about the same number as there are soldiers in Ecuador, just to give you a sense. He has called for a referendum, which will be held this coming Sunday, which includes measures to tighten security. I won't go through each one of the questions, but just to give you a flavor, the armed forces should be allowed to back up the police. They currently are they were under the state of emergency, but this would allow them to continue working hand in hand with the police and patrol streets. Ecuadorian citizens would be allowed to be extradited to face trial abroad. And also one of the key things is that sentences for drug and arms trafficking would be a lot more severe. So mainly giving the armed forces extra powers. And one of the questions you may have is, has this worked so far? After all, we've had soldiers patrolling the streets of Guayaquil, Quito, and the main cities since the state of emergency was declared in January. Well, as of late March, the security forces had detained 16,500 people. So 16,500 rather than half a person. 3,500 of them were suspected drug traffickers. Police had also seized 83 tons of cocaine and decommissioned $3 million in cash. But violent attacks have continued, including attacks on elected officials. So there was one incident just 3 weeks ago where the country's youngest mayor was shot dead. Although it is at this point not entirely clear whether this was gang related, but whatever the reason behind the killing was, it shows that elected officials can and do get killed, even after that shocking incident of the presidential candidate last year. So some things have been achieved. Soldiers went into some of the prisons and freed guards who had been held hostage. But I would say that the government has yet to tackle the prison gangs, which I would argue are behind much of the violence in Ecuador. And President Noboa has said that he's planning on opening 2 maximum security jails, very much in the spirit of what the president of El Salvador is doing there. But that, of course, is often popular in the country itself, but there are a lot of critics, especially human rights critics, who point out that, especially in El Salvador, the human rights abuses that happen within the walls of such maximum security jails are shocking, and who have certainly been very critical of this move. According to the Ecuadorian Prison Service, there are 30,000 people currently locked up. So whatever he decides to do, it is a big task. And prison reform in Latin America, it's not a vote bringer. To the contrary, a lot of people, according to polls, aren't overly bothered if inmates kill each other. So it's not something that in the run-up to an election makes you very popular to solve, to reform prisons. And building maximum security jails sometimes does get you votes, but I would argue that grassroots reform of the prison system doesn't. And the fact that two of the key prison gang leaders, alias Fito and Colon Pito, remain on the run after having escaped from prison in Ecuador does not bode well for this chapter in Ecuador. And another thing that President Noboa can do very little about is the geographical location of Ecuador. It's sandwiched between Colombia and Peru, which of course are the world's two largest producers of cocaine. So it's going to be very, very difficult for him or for anyone, in the coming years, whoever might get elected in the next election, to tackle those routes, which are now well established, to smuggle drugs from Peru and Colombia through Ecuador, which with its, has well-functioning ports and is therefore very attractive to these gangs. So with the next presidential election set for February next year, Noboa has very little time to tackle these massive problems. Which brings me neatly to an election which is looming even larger and nearer, which is the election in Mexico on the 2nd of June. Of course, Mexico has been a country which has long been infiltrated at all levels of government by drug trafficking cartels. At the top level, you just need to look at the trial in the US of the former drug czar, Genaro Garcia Luna. He was found guilty last year of taking bribes from drug cartels and is waiting sentencing in a US prison. He's demanding a retrial, but we'll see if that proceeds. But I don't want to look at the top echelon so much, because I think those who are most at risk in the run-up to this election are actually the candidates for local government. Why? Because they are the ones that make the biggest difference to the cartel's day-to-day lives. So if you can corrupt your local official, then the local official can look away when you're doing your criminal activities. And it's much easier to threaten or corrupt a local official. It's much cheaper, and they normally control the local police force. So you get a lot more bang for your buck. And between January and the end of March, 28 candidates have been attacked, and 16 of those have been killed, with Guerrero being the worst state for this kind of violence. This, of course, as you'd expect, has resulted in some candidates backing out. And while there is a federal security program for candidates, you can apply to it to receive protection, but you can only do that when you've already been threatened. And as you can imagine, oftentimes, then it's already too late. So there was one case just recently of a woman running for the mayor of the town of Celaya, which is one of the towns that is really racked by gang and cartel violence. So this woman, Berta Gisela Gaitan, was shot dead on the 1st of April, and she had requested protection. But while she was waiting for the protection, she was assassinated. So you can imagine that in areas worst affected by cartels, democracy itself is at risk. And one example I'd like to give is going back to 2021, this place called Xilotlan de los Dolores in Jalisco state. There were several candidates running for local office, and 2 of them had been threatened, so they backed out. and the one favored by the local cartel then won by default. The election was later annulled, but in Xilotlan, no extra safety measures have been put in place for this upcoming poll. So that just gives you a flavor of kind of like the threats of these local officials and what they're facing. And while that is a grim picture, there's another grim picture awaiting us in Venezuela, which has a presidential election on the 28th of July. And there the threat is different. It's, I would argue, less by criminal gangs against candidates, but of opposition candidates being hampered by the state itself. So the main opposition candidate, Maria Corina Machado, has been barred from running for office, and the woman who was chosen as a replacement, Corina Lloris, was prevented from registering. So that was it was like computers saying no. She just could not register as a candidate to run. And many opposition journalists and activists and campaign staff have been arrested on spurious charges. So you may ask, what does this have to do with drug trafficking? Well, the government of President Nicolás Maduro has long been accused by the US and others of having ties to drug cartels which use Venezuela as a transit country. The US government has accused President Maduro himself and more than a dozen current and former Venezuelan officials of narco-terrorism. And some of those have been, well, all of those have been indicted, but one of those who's recently been put on trial is a former general, Cliver Alcalá. He was just sentenced last week to 21 years in jail. He'd pleaded guilty to supplying weapons to the FARC from neighboring Colombia. He had denied conspiring with the FARC to ship cocaine through Venezuela, but part of his indictment was also that. But he struck a plea deal and pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of conspiring to traffic arms. And last week, the Maduro government also announced the arrest of the former vice president and the oil minister, Tarek El Hassami, for allegedly stealing public funds. And he's also one of those who was indicted by the US. So that there's also like some internal purge going on there at the moment. But I think the main concern for those combating organized crime is that if, as looks very likely, with all of the hurdles facing the opposition, President Maduro wins another 6-year term in office, criminal gangs will be able to prosper, not just in Venezuela, but in the region. And you just need to look at an example of a gang in Venezuela, which is called the Tren de Aragua, which has spread far and wide through the region. Yet Venezuela's government denies it even exists. So the Chilean government has just recalled its ambassador after the Maduro government just flatly denied the existence of the Tren de Aragua. And I would argue that this denial suggests that the Venezuelan government is unwilling to fight this group. And the fact that also the leader of this Tren de Aragua group, known as Niño Guerrero, managed to flee from Tocorón prison in September and is still on the run, is another indication that the Venezuelan government is unwilling, unable certainly, but also I would argue unwilling to do anything against the Tren de Aragua. Add to that Colombia's ELN rebel group, which has for many years been able to move freely in Venezuela, as well as members of dissident groups of the FARC. I think these groups which continue to play a key role in drug trafficking will be able to extend their power and their reach if the Maduro government stays in power for another 6 years. And that leads me to an even grimmer picture yet, which is I would argue, the probably most, I want to say, depressing and disheartening one in the whole of my region. That's of course Haiti. I'd planned to originally talk about Haiti at length because it is probably the example where criminal gangs have taken such overwhelming control of an entire capital. The latest estimates by the United Nations is now that they control almost 90% of Port-au-Prince. And of course, they have managed with their power to force the Prime Minister to resign and wield not just power in the capital, but also in the bay of Port-au-Prince and control the port and the airport. But the reason why I didn't want to go too much into detail about this is that, sadly, the election that everybody had hoped for, that should be held, by and organised by the Transitional Council, now looks far away. The Transitional Council has said that there won't be a new president in place until February 2026. So even though they haven't named a date for the election, that would suggest that it probably wouldn't be till the end of 2025. So it's moved far, far into the future. And meanwhile, the gangs continue to fight the security forces. And while there's an uneasy alliance between the gangs at the moment, I would argue that won't last very long. And the fights between these gangs are likely to resume. And sadly, those who are caught in the middle are the civilians. And with this grim summary, I hand to
Thanks,
back to you.
That was a great, obviously quite sad overview, but really, really complete. And I'm sure there are going to be, we will discuss about the election, the upcoming election, more in the Q&A. But Raul, I was wondering, looking really more at the dynamics which actually underlie the structure of criminal governance, of these groups in the region, and the fact that they're becoming actually actors in their own, political actors in their own right. In some cases, they have legitimacy as well, also with the local population. Can you share a little bit all your research about how this criminal governance basically come about? And I see there is a question also from Alejandro Pescador on the nexus with the corruption element. So how does all this dimension come together?
Great. I will put my timer too, so I don't, because I tend to speak too much. That's just, thank you, Ari, for inviting me. Thank you, Monica. Vanessa, it's nice to meet you both. And I didn't know what happened in Venezuela. So it's so discombobulated, the number of political movements in the region, that sometimes you can't keep track of. So, and the other thing is journalists working to inform us here, but also in the region and locally are the ones who are giving us the information. And we should be grateful for the risk that they take. Well, right? Yeah. They're taking a lot of risk to do this. I actually was chatting with a journalist in Michoacan in Facebook 2 seconds ago. He was telling me I got laid off from my magazine. He's a journalist from Proceso. So imagine when I did my master thesis. So, well, Latin America. So I want to make some, not theoretical, but more like observations of criminal governance in Latin America. Just to point out a bit of the misunderstanding that I feel that happens with the region, usually. And we're talking about these criminal actors, gangs, drug cartels, that usually both the literature, but also media, not BBC, but many other media. I was seeing a whole video of the Deutsche Welle doing this. So it was like, it's like all over again, like everything in gray. It's horrible, and all drug cartel members and leaders are essentially either El Chapo or the leader of the famous one in Colombia. I just forgot that, and it's or Escobar. No, so these two images, I would say, two mirrors of how we understand gangs and criminal politics in Latin America are kind of deceitful, because usually we think that is either they're rulers in the local regions and they are popular folks, and there's a lot of mythology about the popular folks of drug cartels around the region. So everyone that sees criminal governance across the region said, like, essentially they're the popular guys that are actually governing the places, which I say is no, all the time is more contentious. And the second is like governments are overrun and corrupt by these big drug cartels are following money to the politicians. So obviously there are cases in which happens these things, but these are not the only things happening in the region. So what I try to say in many bases is that the participation of criminal organizations in Latin American politics usually more directed towards two things. One, changing policy of the government. So they're not looking to govern, they're looking to change the policy of the government. For example, get the army out of their way, or get the police out of their way, so they can drug traffic in some cases, or the others protect their businesses. That's why the local dimension is more important than the federal one. That's why we are not seeing, and Vanessa does the perfect thing to say, like, it's more on the local when these things happen. Like Garcia Luna, who was the Secretary of Security with Calderon, is an outlier, actually, of the Latin American case. Because what we're seeing essentially is they are trying to, in some cases, do 2 or 3 things. Either have arrangement with local policemen so they can traffic, and usually this kind of Pax Narca happens, or the other case, they're having conflicts. So instead of seeing or essentializing there's just one way in which organized crime operates and relates with politics, is more a variety of the dynamics of conflict and dynamics of contention. For example, killing political officers, killing policemen, killing judges, killing attorneys' offices. Those happen more actually, but the issue is that usually elections are a political opportunity, so they become enhanced. But if we keep a track of all the politics in the region, we will see more judges, policemen, police officers, and attorneys that represent the Attorney General in some area who are being killed regularly because they get in the middle of those politics. So that's one of the important things that we have to understand. They're acting for private businesses, and politics and the state intervene into this business because it's a market. So all the politics that goes around is a more political economy way to say that Latin America is a contentious dispute between them. And national elections, local elections, state elections, depending if it's a federal central country, are a very good opportunity to change the political arrangement. In the Mexican case, since 1994, since 1989, when we had the first governor of opposition in Baja California, there has been this overall discussion if the transition to democracy provoked drug violence. Clearly not what was the military intervening, but these places are the openings or the places where organized crime tends to rearrange the political rearrangements of the past. So, and talking about corruption, so also the problem is that not all relationships are essentially corruption or agreement, or that the politician is a narco hidden in a suit. It can happen, and it's proved that killing mayoral candidates, governor candidates, officers talks a lot about also some officers that do not comply with drug cartels. That's why they were killed. Fernando Villavicencio, clearly he was pushing an agenda against drug cartels and drug trafficking, because it's also a very popular agenda in Latin America in general, to offer the military to crush cartels and bring some kind of peace in the region and reduce crime. This securitization, militarization, populism that goes around Latin America, and Noboa is the latest in the club of militarization of security policy around the region. It's part of a huge trend in which politicians find that deploying the army is the best way that they can win votes in some occasions. That is part of example, that one of the main key problems that has Gabriel Boric, for example, that in Chile, because he didn't run with that, and he has a lot of problems of security in the south. He tried to not militarize, and now he has been forced to militarize inside of Chile. So let's think this about drug cartels as a political economy of a market around the region. And what the international drug politics, that I'm sure that Monica will talk a lot more than me, I'll just mention it quickly, opens markets. Essentially, when you militarize by pressure of the United States or local pressure or both meet, but it happens in the both ways, you essentially open a market for drug violence and protection. So drug cartel members that dedicate themselves to violence essentially are in the job market. What happens in Latin America, talking about recruitment in general, is that Latin America has low social mobility, a lot of marginalized young men around the region without very good prospect of employment in general. And a lot of these men are just in waiting. Not necessarily that they are unemployed. A lot have employment, but precarious employment, low salaries. So this idea of unemployment as precursor of crime has not been proven, because if depending on the country in Latin America, you will find there are countries with full employment, almost like Mexico. It's 95% of the active economic population is employed. So it's like, where's the unemployment that's creating crime? But essentially what happens in the whack-a-mole of the drug politics around the region is that the national government or the international coalitions, that is usually the US, bank into some country, they open a market, and this market needs to get protection, so they have to recruit massively to resist the militarization of public security. And it's not casual that this happens in places and locations or distribution routes, ports, states that have a lot of international trade. Guayaquil clearly is that case of a port. There is intense for international trade, the ports in the south of Mexico. Colombia was one of the cases. We know a lot of, for example, of how Peru was a key place of drug trafficking in Latin America during the 90s, because it's all the routes that go to the United States, and clearly is driven both by the demand of drugs in the United States, but also by the push from the United States to all the Latin American governments to use militarization. Just to say also that recently there has been a discussion of criminal governance as a way to extract from the local population. But due that the numbers still amount to lot of drug trafficking, I'm one of the skepticals that now organized crime, that has been a running argument, is just extortion and not drugs. And what I say is that it's a symbiotic relation. You do both and you benefit from one for the other. And locally, maybe some gangs infuse into extortion to local population, even killings of local population, and they negotiate justice with the population there, just in order to protect other drug markets. Or in the case of what happened in Guerrero in 2009, when the Beltran Leyva, a powerful drug cartel, was dismantled, is that they recruited local gangs to drug distribution, but when the big part of the organization was dismantled, these local gangs lose their linkage to the international drug market. So they had to shift into extortion. But that doesn't mean that drugs do not have potency, or drug prohibition does have a potency in the explanation. It's because we are in a long-term process of how it's happening. I just want to make some few comments on a few countries, because I'm very interested in showing this. In the case of Mexico, we will have a lot of local candidates running, and usually we will see these attacks more in the south of Mexico. Clearly because the routes of drug cartels or extortion or extraction of oil from pipelines of Pemex, the state-owned oil company, happens there. And also in the center of Mexico, Guanajuato, that is a case of this mayoral candidate, but we have a lot of mining and also oil transportation in the region. That's kind of the dynamic there. So it's not evenly distributed around the country, and it's an opportunity for them. But also there's another dimension that I wonder is, what is they going to do the next government? Because the President López Obrador decided essentially to keep the militarization of public security into his agenda. And the presidential election is going to be key, because we don't know what presidential candidate Claudia Sheinbaum of Morena, who is leading the polls and probably is going to win the election, if something happens from here to June. But I think it would be weird if Xochitl Gálvez, the opposition candidate, wins. What is she going to do? Is she going to continue this policy? So far, so I've read, she doesn't plan to change anything. So the things will continue. But again, like in Ecuador, like in Mexico, and a part of the discourse of Milei in Argentina is this military populism of politics. So you have national presidents promising the military, and then you have local drug cartels resisting that national militarization, and a lot of corruption in the middle of the levels. So this gray zone of corruption is happening in the middle. There are two more things that are happening that we don't know how they're going to end up. First is Colombia. Colombia has challenged sustainedly the international drug prohibition regime. Probably is going to fail more if Donald Trump is elected, because the United States changed its position in the United Nations Conference of the Border Control on Narcotics the past month. So it seems that the US is, if it's not open, it's open for the discussion. But it was open for the discussion in UNGAS 2016, for the ones who know about international drug politics. But also, and I will say that you have that. And on the other case, you have a lot of politicians in the region that will oppose that. Daniel Loboa will arrive to the United Nations conference saying no. Petro is going to arrive saying yes. Lula will say nothing because he says nothing about drug policy, which is remarkable. Doing that, one of the countries with the highest homicide rates in the region is Brazil, by all the violence in the favelas. And in the case of Haiti, I have just one question that is not, I have an answer, because that's what we're going to see in the next months, is this guy, Chassel, who is the leader of the most famous leader of the gangs. They call him Barbecue, I think. That's his nickname. I don't usually like to use the nicknames because it's like they have real names, and also the government puts the nicknames, not themselves. That the Calderon put all the nicknames to the leaders. The federal police did that for long years. But this guy, Chassel, what is his game? And that's what we're going to see in the next months, if he attempts to make a jump from just gangs to politics, because there is a long tradition of political violence. And I think that he was a kid when the Tonto Macoutes, when Baby Doc was in power in Haiti. For the ones that know about Haitian history, it was a dictator who used a gang, a racket, to beat all the opposition. There was Baby Doc. That is a racket that created his dad, Papa Doc, or Jean-Claude Duvalier. So a lot of this also has to do with tactics that these criminal organizations use. They have learned either from counterinsurgency, for example, Los Zetas, that were former military guys training counterinsurgency, or guys that have been learned from guerrillas. That is the case of Jalisco Nueva Generación in Mexico, is the biggest cartel right now. And many of the members, I think they're from EPR. I have some traces on the information regarding that. And I just close with that. But if we see these things, we have not to confuse them as political actors in the sense of they want to govern, but more like any other political actor in the market that wants to change policy. Chassel may be different. He might transform himself if the transitional council fails. That could happen, but at this point we don't know, because there has happened that some brave leader, that he is a gang leader, overthrows the council, doesn't let Ariel Henry come back and rule Haiti, because he has been ruled by dictators before. So it's a long history of 2 centuries of Haiti, of coup d'etat, as this is happening in the region. But usually what we are going to find is more how they intersect into politics and use them as an advantage for their opportunities. But the overall question for the democratic leaders that are going to be elected this year, and they were elected last year, in January, was Bukele, elected president, re-elected unconstitutionally. Actually, he's a dictator now. Like if someone is having a doubt, he overrun the constitution. He's now a dictator. He just went to the military with the National Congress of El Salvador and imprisoned all the gangs in El Salvador in a maximum prison. And we were talking before the break that prisons are really risky in Latin America. There are a lot of escapes from prisons, actually in Haiti. Manager was telling us about how they basically liberate all the prisoners, including the assassins on Jovenel Moïse in Haiti. So they are offering that. That's the electoral offer. But the problem is that the other side of the politics, that is Gustavo Petro and rethinking the war on drugs in the region, is not gaining traction in the region. So that's also to add to the bleak scenario in Latin America. And I will stop there.
No, that's great, and I think it's good how you highlighted that it's different type of political agenda. Right? They're not like the classic insurgent, non-state group that you see in other regions of the world. It's more actually becomes political because of the a political economy kind of target. So I think it's very interesting, and to see also how they're evolving, especially because of Haiti. I think is interesting because obviously these guys actually asking to be part of the political process. So it's quite different, but it's quite important. And I think also what you were mentioning about the securitization of the militarization of security policy and the solution, Bukele solution, the Bukelization of that, which is also one of the questions we have. How is it going to play out, and what are the problem or the shortcoming or the trade-off with obviously human rights and democratic institutions? And I'm sure, so we already have quite a number of questions here, but just before we go into that, Monica, if you could just, I guess, expand a little bit more on this criminal governance, especially the relationship with rule of law and also the justice system, which is quite one of the weak points in the equation, but also really looking at how do these dynamics I mean, we've already heard about that a little bit from Raul and Vanessa, but how those dynamics at the local level actually reflect to the global level and vice versa, because there is a lot of
going back and forth. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Irene, for making this possible. It is really very important to be able to have this conversation in a place like the IISS because of what it's at stake. And let me just start with a figure from the Latin American Barometer, which are the polls that have been assessing the quality and the state of democracy since transition of democracy in the region. And according to the 2020 data, 13% of those polled by Latino Barometer, which amounted to nearly 80 million people, reported living in conditions of criminal governance. And when I started doing research on this issue, I started looking into Colombia, and I'm gonna make a little confession here because that was, in fact, when I was first involved with the IISS, and there was the expectation of me writing an Adelphi paper. And I did not realize until afterwards that I did not, in the end, want to write the Adelphi paper because it would have led me to justify Plan Colombia. And I felt morally against that because I knew that that was not the answer. It was the answer for Colombia at that moment, I have to accept now in retrospect, but it's not the answer for the problem of drugs. And I could not imagine at that point that my own country would follow on the steps of Colombia and end in the tragedy that today has taken the lives just in the last election of more than 24 candidates, mostly at the local level, but every day in the news you have, even today, there was just yesterday another one who was the victim of an attack. Luckily, he survived. So Ecuador, Vanessa was mentioning Ecuador, a country that had remained for all purposes peaceful. I remember my professor Malcolm Dees, the expert on Colombia at Oxford, saying that Ecuador had never felt tempted to the ideas that were trendy in places like Peru, where they thought, oh, this thing about coca had indigenous roots, and there was a kind of romanticization of the drug theme. And yet what we see is that Ecuador, a country that had remained relatively peaceful, now finds itself really squeezed between the two countries that had been mostly affected, particularly Colombia, but also Venezuela, and is now showing the highest homicide rate in the region, 45 per 100,000. So violence very clearly has become one of the main manifestations of how the drug problem impacts in countries as it travels. And it travels, we have to remember, to a large extent because of the impact of counter-narcotic policies and the associated balloon effect. So as one country tries to clamp down on the drug trade, that creates the conditions then for another country catching the industry and becoming the engine, which is what happened, and that's what, in very simplistic terms, explains where Ecuador is now. So we had countries, clearly Colombia, Mexico, Honduras, identified, and scholars today continue to debate as to whether there were factors that had created the conditions for these countries to become the main engines of the drug trade, and thus becoming also the violent epicenters of the drug trade. But what we are seeing now is that countries that had remained the most stable countries, where democratic institutions had managed more or less to survive, clearly Costa Rica above all, but over the years and the decades of transition to democracy, places like Argentina and certainly Uruguay had been the countries that had been perceived as enjoying perhaps the most state capacity. And yet we are seeing there how the homicide trend is also showing worrying signs. In these countries, state capacity has not in any way avoided the contagion of the violence that has traces of drug dynamics. Challenges to democracy and democratic governance were evident from the outset, and they were initially expressed mostly, but continue to this day, mostly as countries were forced to resort to the military to try to contain the drug problem and drug dynamics. My view, having studied this for many decades, is that with a change in drug policy, countries in the region will have no choice but to continue resorting to the military. The choice will then be as to what strategy, what would be the policy, and what would be the strategy, the security strategy, informing the deployment of the military. But the military are bound to stay if there is no change in drug policy. Other manifestations of the drug problem in undermining democracy have been present very clearly through corruption, and above all, the funding of electoral campaigns. And we tend, and journalists, scholars, academics tend to repeat corruption as being one problem that is part of the equation of the drug problem, very easily forgetting how this is not the classical type of corruption that we talk about in normal politics. It's a very particular expression of corruption that accrues from the decision of states to declare a market illicit. And it thus involves the transfer of illicit rent to actors that will operate illicitly because states decide that those markets will remain illicit. This clearly affects state institutions, above all the justice system and the police, and you may have heard about the rule of plata or plomo. Those are the choices with which state actors are confronted. Those who try to resist will most likely face the threats, as the candidate of Ecuador, Villavicencio, who was himself a journalist, investigating the links and the connections between drug trafficking and politics. And those who decide not to resist or to tolerate, pay a blind eye, or even cooperate, will then be basically taken as corrupt actors, but it's a very particular kind of corruption. What can we say about this, about corruption and the fragility of the justice system and the police? I think it's very clear that debates on the state capacity in the region have long seen the state in Latin America as being chronically weak because of path-dependent variables and explanations. But some countries, these that I have mentioned before, countries like Costa Rica, like Argentina, like Uruguay, were considered to have relatively strong state capacity. And impunity was something that was not necessarily associated with these countries. Yet, what we are seeing is that in Argentina, in Costa Rica, in Spain, we were talking about Spain, how these actors challenge state authorities and really sap state capacity by putting the justice system against the wall. In Spain, 2 police officers were killed a few months ago in it's really like a film scene. Drug traffickers were trying to push drugs in speedboats. The police were chasing them with not as powerful boats, and the traffickers killed the 2 police while laughing at them. Not different from the scenes that we are seeing in Latin America. And I think this tells us about the difficulty of really believing one of the arguments that is often mentioned in relation to state capacity, that it's all about impunity, that if only if there is political will and there is the conviction and the determination to carry out investigations, then impunity will close the gap and violence will go down and things will go back to normal. The way in which state capacity is being challenged by violent non-state actors across the region or in countries, including Spain, I think tells us something that we need to pay attention to. So to summarize, how this come about? I have no time to tell a long story, but let me just say that this is very closely connected to the role the US has played for more than 1 century in driving drug prohibition and the international drug control regime, despite the fact that the US, having experienced many of the problems I have referred to in association with the drug problem in Latin America, the US experienced those problems and similar symptoms during the years of alcohol prohibition. But the fact is that the same people that were pushing for alcohol prohibition, when they eventually failed and alcohol prohibition was repealed in the US, then organized to make sure that drug prohibition would prevail, and not only as a US domestic law, but also as an international regime. And the US and these people succeeded, even playing a very important role in the League of Nations in the first half of the 20th century. We then saw successive wars on drugs launched from within the US, starting with opium and heroin in the first half of the 20th century and the early post-war period, then against marijuana, and as had happened with alcohol prohibition, where consumers just traded for whatever was less risky. Instead of drinking 3 bottles of beer, what they did was they switched to spirits. Well, the same happened in relation to drugs when the US declared the war on marijuana, that opened the doors to fantastic cocaine, and we've seen successive waves. Then there was the second war declared by Reagan on cocaine, and what we have was the rise of methamphetamines and now fentanyl. The US is a very peculiar case and has been a very peculiar case all along these decades. From the very early 20th century, the Supreme Court decided that maintenance, what we would call today harm reduction could not be considered a legitimate medical practice. And what we are seeing now is that the US, with over 100,000 overdose deaths, is a country that has, according to Ethan Nadelman, one of the people who knows best about US drug trends, has more than double the rate of countries in the OECD. And that is because of this bias in favor of prohibition and drug control. The US would probably not have that number of overdose deaths if it were to follow the steps of Switzerland or other countries that have harm reduction and maintenance programs. So how can we get out from this trap? It's almost impossible for Latin American countries. They tried in 2016 at the UN, calling for a special session of the General Assembly at the UN. The fact of the matter is that there's no room for consensus, and that is because a significant number of countries who happen to be authoritarian countries can manage with the drug problem by resorting to extreme means, including the death penalty. So they mentioned without any qualms that they had no problem because they can deal with the drug problem through their own means. The fact is that by keeping prohibition and punitive counter-narcotic policies in place, the US keeps, and I don't want to use hegemonic, but in the end it's a kind of hegemonic leverage that keeps judgment suspended in relation to most Latin American politicians, because whether they do something or no against drugs, they will always be suspected of being collaborating with the drug trade and drug traffickers. And why is that? Because imagine a situation like Ecuador is facing now, where the president made a mistake that the Mexican president made in 2006, which was to declare a war on drugs against all the gangs, the 22 gangs that he has identified as terrorist groups. That cannot be a viable strategy for any country. In confronting these violent, powerful actors, states need, and state authorities need to take choices and to decide to go, I think, against the most violent above all. But that turns those state authorities into suspects of collaboration, because by going into one, you are by default favoring and handing over the market to the other actors. Petro, the Colombian president, has called again for another dialogue, another effort on drug policy reform. I see little or no prospect, partly for the reasons that Raúl has already mentioned.
Yeah, that's I guess the never-ending question, what to do with drug policies, and I guess it's we were discussing about that just before. And,
I can come back to some of the international
yeah.
dimensions and how the externalities, including the diplomatic crisis between Mexico and Ecuador, a very serious one right now.
But I see that we are already actually past 5, so I wanted to open first to the audience here, if there is any question, and then we'll, okay, you first, if you can just introduce yourself briefly for the speakers.
Yes, good afternoon everyone. My name is Andres Pinto. I'm from Mexico. I'm currently a master's student at IISS. And I mean, first of all, thank you so much for your time. It's a privilege as a student to have the opportunity of listening to so much expertise on issues that not only are important to me personally, but for my country. So it's great that we're having this conversation so here. My question was fairly answered by Dr. Monica, but it's about how can Latin America succeed on a reform on the a secure reform on the normative framework on combating drugs to approaching more into human rights and succeeding to having human security. We had the lost opportunity, I feel, in the UNGAS in 2016, because there was the push of including the human rights dimension into drugs, into the world drug problem, but there wasn't a response locally to what Dr. Serrano explained of the national pressures and the authoritarian government's push into disallowing that to happen in the multilateral fora. But I believe it's a matter that needs to happen from the bottom up, so from the local level. Do we see that as a possibility in the future, and how can it play out?
Great, thank you. I'll take a couple of questions. I think this is for you, Monica, if you want to note it down. Please.
Thank you. I'm just curious, and bearing in mind that in Mexico, several of the candidates were selected by organized crime, and they are now in positions to be elected for. What happens next? Like, what are the tools you have to take them out of those positions?
Once the people that have been selected by
right
the
now they are candidates that have been selected by organized crime, and you have certain cartels saying we selected all of these people.
So they infiltrated.
They're in office and they're like representatives. So what do you do? What are the steps you take to?
How do you deal with those kind of what we've seen sometimes criminal state, right? What do you do when the criminals are actually in the state position? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Theo. I do geopolitics at the University of Sussex. So I like to thank the panel because this topic isn't often covered in my degrees. We normally look at kind of Eurasia and Russia. So this is really informative. And I'd like to ask about Brazil, and in particular the Amazon. I've heard that, I believe, First Command and Red Command, these two gangs, they moved operations into the Amazon out of the large cities. And I'm wondering, as the Amazon is where Brazil's state capacity is weak, will this activity escalate, and will it potentially destabilize the Brazilian state and spill over into neighbouring countries like Peru?
It's already. Please.
Thanks very much. My name is Amita Banerjee, and I work for an NGO called the Global Leadership Foundation. That was a fascinating set of presentations. There was one country that wasn't mentioned because it doesn't immediately come up in the context of organized crime, I guess, but it is Guatemala. And it has become a very important case study at the moment because the Pacto de Corrupto could not prevent the electoral process from electing Bernardo Arevalo. And that has become quite an important case also because of the international focus from the United States, from the OAS, from the European Union. Does the panel think that the Pacto de Corrupto will also win in Guatemala eventually? And how much of a stake is there in keeping Arevalo in office and his program for fighting corruption and impunity becoming successful?
That's a good question. Shall we do this first four? I don't know, Monica, if you want to take the first one.
Yeah, but, it's not a question easy to address. But let me say that in 2016, the reason I think why human rights did not play the prominent role that it should have taken was partly because the human rights view that prevailed was very much the European one, which related to harm reduction. And the way human rights are being affected by the drug problem and the wars on drugs in Latin America, which is basically civilians being caught in the midst of criminal forms of governance, especially when they become or turn violent, was not something that was really in the minds of the countries that were leading. But as important as this was the fact that the countries were not ready to cooperate and to lead the debate in the 2016 session. Mexico, it was really very poor that Mexico and Colombia were competing rather than trying to lead together. There were explanations for that. The term of Santos, he was facing re-election. Calderon's term was coming to an end, having been criticized by his wars on drugs. So it was just not feasible. But it's very difficult as well to bring the human rights dimension to the fore because of the way these illicit economies turn the civil society and members of civil society into part of that economy and thus complicit of what goes on. And the fact of the matter is that populations tend to remain silent either because they know these exchanges are criminal and they are benefiting from them, or because they are under the terror when things turn sour for criminal organizations. And there, I cannot expand on this. What explains a peaceful criminal governance context and what explains a violent, but just very simply to argue that it depends partly on the nature of the criminal organization, but even if a criminal organization may prefer peaceful and non-violent means and clientelar forms of governance, the fact of the matter is that because of counter-narcotic policies, they are vulnerable to criminal competition, and when criminal competition takes off, then they will have to respond with the same means, and the chances of them turning to violent means increase. And that is when the human rights violations take place.
Thanks, Mike. So the second question was more about how do we deal with the criminal when they are in charge of the criminal.
About the political parties. Again, in Mexico, I think the political parties have been negligent and have done basically nothing. López Obrador knew about the mayor from Iguala, where they disappeared. I don't know if you've heard about the students, the 43 students disappeared. There was very clear evidence that that mayor was a criminal, a violent criminal who had blood in his hands. And although some steps were taken by some political actors, the party itself did nothing, and parties continue to just bid on the electoral chances, even sometimes capitalizing on the tragedies of candidates. So neither electoral authorities nor the political parties are doing anything to stop candidates that are being pushed by criminal organizations or criminal actors that are themselves seeking political careers. So I think that it would be difficult to stop that trend, but something could be done, as was done in Italy, that is not being done in Mexico. I believe in Colombia, there is also, I was trying to get more information on this. I couldn't get a response from Ariel Avila, a journalist, but I believe that in Colombia, they also, if a candidate is being investigated or is under suspicion of being in collusion with organized crime, then not only the candidate is pulled off the lists, but the place remains frozen, which is what happened in Italy. In Italy, the councils, I believe, were kept empty.
Great. Did you want to add something on the human rights dimension of the?
Yes, I think the human rights question really interested me, because I think that's one that we see a lot, where the population often, rejoices at first when people are arrested, but then as the dragnet is cast very wide, families are affected, and they realize that innocent people get caught up in the dragnets. And I think the answer to that is strengthening the judicial system. So if you have people who are arrested and if they can, go to trial quickly and prove their innocence, before an independent court, that would definitely help. And then the reform of the prison system as well, so that the prisons aren't as corrupt as they are now. But I would say the answer to that is definitely strengthening the judicial system, because the arrests in themselves, you don't want impunity either, but you obviously have to find that right balance between just having mass trials like you have now in El Salvador, and so you need to really strengthen that judicial system. So have proper representation, not mass trials, not people being in jail for 2.5 years awaiting trial, and then being caught up in the prison riots. At the moment the situation is just so bad. That's why I think these prison gangs in Ecuador were able to flourish.
Thanks, Vanessa. And the Amazon issue is actually quite an interesting one, because it's really, in a way, a reflection of what we have discussed, the transnational nature of all those gangs, and the PCC and the Comando Vermelho as well. And also the fact that, in a way, they're actually very flexible in reconfiguring their business according to the demand, in this case, the European demand and the market. But I'll let Raul say something more on the Brazil issue. And if you want to add also something on the Guatemala question, which is... And
I think that I'm going to Guatemala and then go to the case of Brazil, because in the case of Guatemala, but also packing it with Honduras and El Salvador, to see it regionally, what we're seeing essentially is kind of the trend of the US policy towards Central America, in which some cases they push for political intervention, and for other cases they just see outside and they don't want to engage a lot. That was the case of El Salvador. So the problem is that for the United States, it's very convenient, the case of El Salvador, because they can trust in Bukele to be accessory to US politics, and in the case of stopping drug trade to Central America. They lost all their influence in Honduras at the point that the wife of Zelaya is now the president, Xiomara Castro. So that tells that it's the sloppiness of the United States foreign policy within the region, in which they could gather a lot of political arrangement with OAS for Guatemala, but not for the other two countries. And I think there's a problem of the Latin American countries and leaders of the region that also happens in Central America, that either the US, Africa, and France take a lot of the lead in this politics when it should be a regional politics. Why was, in this case, Nigeria thinking of sending a peacekeeping operation in Haiti? I know that there is the tenet of Brazil and the peacekeeping operations in Haiti, but clearly they left all Latin America out of the Haitian problem until CARICOM decided to take all the politics of the region towards Haiti. And in the case of Central America, clearly in the case of Guatemala, you had a lot of support from all the Latin American countries. So you have there essentially the sloppiness of the US foreign policy. So it depends a lot if the regional forces decide to have a congruent policy or not, but clearly the Latin American international politics is a mess, because you have the right and the left fighting between them. Arevalo was what we should expect, but clearly they have different interests between country and country. In the case of the Amazonias, I think it's really interesting if we see, to talk also about local security and human rights, because they have the same connection. That is, what changed a lot, or what happened in the Amazonias, is the national policy, in the case of Lula, towards deforestation. And clearly Lula retook the policy that created with Marina Silva during the previous government, that was essentially working with local communities and with the indigenous communities to protect the Amazonias. So this was a very good effort in which they can protect communities with the local inhabitants. So you can create state capacity in that way. The problem also in the state capacity debate in general is that the only state capacity that exists is that the state goes with military man to shoot. But no, the state is also a network of political connections, very John Scott way of seeing the world. Like essentially you can create in this case, linkages with them. What Bolsonaro did was leading free ride. So that all these commanders there, essentially they got into the free market of Bolsonaro, and now Lula is taking back. But the problem is the problem grew with him. So they have the other problem with the Amazonians and Venezuela and the border. But also, I would challenge anyone who could say in this moment, yes, any European and US state could govern the Amazonias. It's very difficult to govern a force of that dimension. So no state can do that. Only think it with military guys. So a lot of the security policies that have to be rethought is about how do you create local communities and that are able to provide some certainty information, communal police. And in Mexico has happened a lot of times when you have at least some local efforts to reorganization of the police forces, you can at least tame some part of the crimes. But clearly, these efforts are not enough because you have the national politics banging, and yes, you can create a great local police, but when the military comes and the president says like there's a lot of cocaine there, it's ruined again. So that's a problem. The local gets triumphed by that. So and also there was a lot of in the UN politics, how the United Nations Office for Drug and Crime is very prohibitionist, and also the High Commissioner for Human Rights was silent on the issue until this year when Wolf Tucker, who is the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, made the first report ever in the history of the United Nations about the linkage between drug policy and human rights violations. In 2023, so we haven't experienced this for over 6-7 decades, and the UN had no report by the UN. There's tons of reports by many other organizations, by the UN saying that there is a linkage. So that's a problem of the international politics. They're not keeping up because clearly doing that report would involve fighting with the US. And what I see is the US is not fighting too many fights they used to fight in this. Not enough that they're going to oppose, but they're like letting things go and they're going to veto in the right moment. That's what's going to better have. They have fun with drug policy, and when they reach the consensus, they're going to torpedo it down. I feel that that's what's going to happen. And if it's Trump, they're not going to let it slide because the drug crisis, fentanyl crisis in the US.
That can change a little bit the dynamics of the fentanyl.
Oh,
Because you cannot really do it just by seizing drugs, right, or the military. The quantity are so small that you need to find other ways which are not just securitizing the fentanyl. The war on drugs, right, is a different type of drugs.
But also the problem is that I don't think that that's what Trump thinks. Like
for
Trump,
sure, yeah. Well,
and the Republicans in general, like the whole party. That the problem is not him, is the whole party saying that we just have to bomb laboratories in Mexico. He actually said that. Like it's in the book of the former Secretary of Defense. Like it's not a joke. He's thinking about bombing Mexico. Yeah. And we should be scared about that. I'm still scared that he's planning to bomb with drones Mexico. He could actually do it because he asked directly to the Secretary of Defense. It's not a hypothetical. He didn't ask his friend. Like he said to the Secretary of Defense, "What if we do it?" That the escalation will happen again, and that's very concerning if Trump gets elected.
Definitely. So we are almost. But I just said. So I have a couple of questions here. I think we kind of answered some of them, but I have two questions. One, I wanted to ask Vanessa just because Raul mentioned Haiti, and we were actually discussing just before why I don't think there is actually a desire from the US to exclude Latin American countries from the solution. I think it's more self-exclusion, right? Because we have seen Brazil being very quiet. This morning we were at a briefing with the Foreign Minister of Chile, and the Foreign Minister of Chile was saying, yeah, we're not, we did participate 15 years ago, but now we don't have the resources to participate. So I guess one question for you, Vanessa, is really what is going on? Why is actually the Kenyan, which are the one that are intervening anyway? So
Kenya, sorry,
if you can,
I made a mistake.
Yeah, I didn't want to correct you, but it's Kenya.
No, it's perfectly fine.
So, and the other question, which is actually covered here quite a lot, is what is the role of the military? And now, I mean, as you said, Monica, obviously we are expecting to see more military involvement because it's the only way to basically really do the war on drugs. But I think there were a lot of questions on what is the role of the military. Is there a difference between conservative and liberal forces in Latin America with respect to how to deal with the drug problems? So I guess the 80 for UNS, and then the other two maybe for you on the military role, since I know that you vote and you just submitted a paper on that. So
Yeah, exactly.
On Haiti, I just, before I go into Kenya, I wanted to just pick up on what Raul said about gangs not looking to govern, and I think that's spot on. And it actually, I think it also applies to Haiti. And in a lot of the 2 ways I did for BBC Radio, they asked me like, well, what's the game plan of the gangs? What do they want? Do they really, do they want to govern? And I spoke to a couple of experts on that, and they both agreed that the gangs do not want to govern. That it's what you said. It's about looking to influence policy and kind of like positioning themselves. But even Barbecue, I don't think, wants to govern. He's an ex-policeman. He allegedly had the backing of Jovenel Moïse before Jovenel Moïse was killed, and he's looking to have somebody in power who is buddies with him, who provides him with guns, who provides him with power. Barbecue gets a lot of his money from controlling the Varro fuel terminal, so he gets his money from extorting people, and whoever wants to import anything through the port and the fuel terminal has to pay him substantial sums. So he's got an interest in keeping that status quo. And that's why he was really instrumental in kind of like creating this chaos, because I don't want to call it an uprising, because I don't think it is, but in creating this chaos, because he was really worried that if the Kenyan police force led a multinational security force, that he would be the one targeted. Why? Because you can kind of like secure the fuel terminal. If you've got enough men, you could just kind of like get Barbecue's men out of the fuel terminal, secure those main roads that he controls, and then he's out of a job and he's out of money. Whereas there's other gang leaders who the experts have told me are much more powerful than Barbecue, who are in the shadows. Some of them are not so much in the shadow. There's one guy called Izo who also likes to produce rap videos. Exactly. Izo controls a lot of the arms trade. So Izo is not overly worried about the Kenyans coming, because as we know, drugs trade and arms trafficking flourish even in countries which have a working democracy and which have got like a functioning system. So, never mind Haiti where there's none of that. So they're not as fussed as Barbecue. And so I don't think he's after power, he's just after having somebody who's kind of like his mate in a position of power. But yeah, there's much more dangerous people in the shadows there. And as for why Kenya, well, there were Caribbean countries who did say that they'd send forces, but then as the situation on the ground deteriorated so much, a few of them have pulled out because they just don't think there's enough security for them to go in. And also, there hasn't been much work done on the rules of engagement. So what if somebody from a multinational security force shoots a civilian by mistake or not by mistake? Kind of like what happens then? And because there's no functioning authority, executive, judicial system, there's no one there to lay those ground rules.
Right?
And so, exactly. And so there's a lot of forces which have gotten worried and which have backed out. And within the Kenyan force, even our stringer in Kenya spoke to some of the people who had volunteered, because it would have been volunteers to go on that mission, and some of them have backed out and seeing the situation. So already the numbers are down. But the Kenyan president, is keen to be seen as somebody who's going to provide.
And you don't see any appetite from Latin American government to take the lead on the solution more than the deployment? Not really. No.
After the cholera crisis, they
Yeah,
are
exactly.
very scared.
That's the problem. Yeah.
And also on the ground, when a lot of Haitians do not want to see outsiders meddling. Of course, the question is, well, what's the alternative? But because of their history, they want a Haitian solution. And a lot of the criticism against the Transitional Council is now that it was imposed on us by CARICOM, and there should be a homegrown solution. But, I don't see one on the horizon. So.
And just to finish
on the military,
and if you see any difference between Liberia
the
and
The challenge of policing prohibition became very clear to the US with alcohol prohibition. There's a book by Lisa McGeer that shows very clearly how, for police forces in the US, they were either tempted and corrupted, or it became an impossible job. The morale of police crumbled, and with society not backing prohibition, for any policeman or policewomen, this would be a very demoralizing job. But prohibition is in place, and prohibition will not disappear anytime soon, even under Biden, where there has been some measure and some degree of change in drug policy. For the first time ever, the drug czar is a medical doctor, even though with a controversial record in terms of harm reduction. The fact of the matter is that prohibition will not disappear, and thus for Latin American countries this means that in terms of policing and creating conditions for policing, there has to be a mix. And the record in Mexico shows that the best cases where some measure of peace has been recovered involve local state police efforts, very committed efforts, but backed by the military. And the military have to be there in case they are needed when a challenge of a higher caliber manifests itself. So there has to be a convergence of forces. In Colombia, they have talked about intermediary forces that could be deployed rapidly in case needed. But it has to be a day-to-day effort. In Italy, I believe the deployment of the military was done also to back and to create the space for judicial investigation. So that would be the only way to try to keep some measure of justice also afloat.
Do you want to add anything, Raul?
Yeah, what I just finished. I was telling a draft paper. I hope that it goes and flies somewhere. But you know, if you're an academic, you know that these papers get published thousands of years later. But which I document what happened in Mexico, that has been happening in all Latin America. That is the involvement of the military, also in non-military affairs, in civilian tasks. Obviously, it's a problem of the region that, now that it doesn't have interwars between them, the military has historically questioned themselves as what is the role. And clearly public security became the natural force for them to justify their existence in all Latin America. And now all governments and presidents have come to realize, civilians realize that they need the military because they have essentially equality with the US on drug policy, but there are also populist terms on which drug policy and militarization comes. Essentially, people ask for that. Nowadays, Mexico, 72% of the population, according to the last INEGI survey, trust in the military. It's the most trusted organization of the government, the church, the universities, and the family. So you could imagine that in lots of Latin America, it depends. In several countries, changes also if they had a history with military dictatorships during the 20th century. But they're fairly popular for many of the local population because they feel that they are the solution for everything. And the problem is, you can use the military for several things, but they are essentially subrogate that authority altogether. Like currently, the drug policy and security policy in Mexico is led by the military. Like there's not a civilian guiding the military to do stuff. It's their bosses, and now they're taking tasks that one wouldn't think they should be doing, because there's these biases on thinking that the military can do everything, because they seem like a huge workforce of logistical capacity and pristine non-corruption, which isn't true. There's a lot of reports about corruption, mismanagement in the military forces in Latin America and the Caribbean for decades now, and also inefficiency. Like the military before President Lopez Obrador, who has militarized a lot of the public administration, They tried to build a wall for a refinery in Tula. And they spent all the money, they didn't build the wall. So, and now they built a train and the train derailed. So it kind of tells you how not that brilliant is the Mexican army. But now they're doing tasks that they shouldn't be doing, like distributing vaccines or books. And you would think, well, state capacity in Latin America is short, you would need them.
They did it here as well, by the way.
Sorry?
The vaccine.
In Brazil, and many countries did that, but Mexico had the best vaccination rate in the whole continent. Basically, every kid in Mexico had a vaccination of all the basic vaccines for 1 year, and I checked the numbers. And they dropped with López Obrador for the first time in history. And now we have cases of tuberculosis and rubella happening and reported by the health authorities. Because for some reason they think that they can do better things. The military in all the world, they give this idea of efficiency and capacity. And in the US, they are very good at doing this. They have this industrial complex. But the problem is that when they take all of this under businesses, it's really difficult to take them out of civilian tasks. And in Latin America, it's very hard to control the military. In Chile, they did it with a lot of effort, and they still have those problems with the military. In Argentina, they did, but now they're going back, which is kind of scary too. Milei is...
Because of drugs?
Because of drugs.
Milei is tantalizing with that.
Yeah. On this happy note, we had a lot of other questions. Actually, we had a question on China, but I think we'll have to do another event on fentanyl and the role of China in drug trafficking in Latin America. So stay tuned for the next event. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much to Monica, Vanessa, and Raul.